But in any case, it's a really nice pleasure for me to introduce Geneive Abdo, who's come up to be with us today. I first met our guest in 2000 in Tehran, and I don't know if she remembers, but I hadn't been to Iran before, and I asked a friend of mine, and she happens to be in the audience, I wouldn't embarrass her. I said, I'm going to Iran, what should I bring? And she said, oh, bring booze. I said, are you crazy? And do you want me to get arrested? She said, no, they won't bother you. And she was right. So I took a couple of bottles of Zaytuna vodka. Kind of, I don't know why. Maybe I wrote so I could test the system. But in any case, I remember seeing our guest for the first time in the guest house of the Foreign Ministry of the Islamic Republic of Iran. She came in a black chador, and we sat down and I handed her a bottle of Zaytuna, and she seemed quite happy with that. But I had known her before then from her writing, because I had read her manuscript for her very fine book, No God But God, on Egypt, which is really a first-rate study of Egyptian society, and particularly the Islamicization of Egyptian society, and sort of wonderful analysis in, you know, in the sort of sense of ethnographic richness and so on. Clearly done by someone with a great empathy for Egypt and at the same time a very good critical eye. And it's a first-rate book, published by Oxford also, if I remember correctly. And then she moved, you were in Egypt for 5 years? Yeah. Moved from 4 years, and moved from Egypt to Iran with her husband Jonathan Lyons, correct? And then wrote a second book on Iran, Answering to God, yes, which is also a first-rate book on Iran. In fact, I know a lot of people have used it in courses and that kind of thing. And then she came back to the States, really transiting in, I think, in an important sense from the world of journalism, because at that point you were writing for The Guardian, as I remember, and other papers, to really, you know, life as an intellectual and a writer in America. She, in the process, won a Guggenheim Fellowship, which, as you know, is quite distinguished, and was also at Harvard University as a Nieman Fellow. That was some years ago. 2002. Yeah. So really, someone who's really made her mark, and then became interested in the subject of Muslims in America, and wrote her latest book, also published by Oxford, Mecca and Main Street. For those of you who've read it, you know, it's really a good read. So we have someone with us today who's very special, who's demonstrated a sort of impressive breadth of interest and an ability, frankly, to do field work which would probably stand her in very good stead in the Department of Anthropology here at Boston University, among other places. So it gives me really great pleasure to welcome her today, and to particularly welcome her to this building, which I especially adore, and to this university, which I feel very fondly about as well. So, Geneive, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
I'm very honored to be here, and as Professor Norton mentioned, we've known each other for a long time, and thank you so much for that kind introduction and your amazing memory. But I wanted to give you some idea of, I guess, my own journey through mosques and Islamic communities here in the United States, and sort of related to what Professor Norton just explained. When I came back to the United States, when I started observing the Muslim community here, I began seeing some parallels and between sort of what I'd observed in the Islamic world, and particularly the Arab world, and also what was happening inside Islamic communities here. And that's what drove me to start doing research about Muslims in America. I then joined a project at the UN, which was called the Alliance of Civilizations, and that also, to some degree, influenced this book, because what this project is trying to do is sort of, at least as its stated purpose, the project was created by Kofi Annan to bridge the divide, and I'll speak to some degree about that later, because I don't think that it has actually achieved this purpose. And so I'm going to sort of speak about these kinds of topics later in terms of how Muslims, not only in the United States but worldwide, have sort of dealt with issues such as Islamophobia and the growing, so-called clash of civilization thesis. So, but just as a beginning, I think that, as I mentioned, because of my own work as a journalist and as a researcher in the Islamic world, I did bring some knowledge to the subject, and as I've become more detached, I guess, from that experience, I go to the Middle East several times a year, but I realized that the Muslim experience that I'm going to explain can actually be viewed through two different lenses. One question, I think, and you might want to think about this as I provide the narrative and tell you about the communities, I think a big question is, are there really parallels here? Are we seeing parallels between the Muslim communities here and the Islamic world in sort of visible ways, such as, the increase of women wearing headscarves, the increase in mosque attendance, the institution building that we're seeing in the United States? Is this happening for the same reasons that it's happening among Muslim populations in Europe, for example? So can we conclude then that Muslims who live as minorities in Western societies, that they're going to behave predictably in certain ways, that there are going to be certain patterns of immigration, whether it's in the United States or Europe, that are similar? So I think that that's an important question. But I think also the other question is, has what's been happening here, this sort of increase or this intensification of an Islamic identity, is this due to global events? So, or what we see, is what we're seeing in the United States due to 9/11? Is it due to the United States foreign policy globally? So is it some response to Muslims here either identifying with Muslims abroad or conversely trying to distinguish themselves from Muslims abroad? So these are some of the questions that I tried to explore as I went about my research. And in the beginning, I have to say that my inclination was to try to find these parallels. So, I approached the subject and thought, okay, we're seeing this intensification of Islamic identity. We're seeing this public religiosity in the Muslim population here that really didn't exist before. So this must be the same reasons that it's happening in Europe and the Arab world. And I guess as I moved toward the end of the book, I realized that it's more complicated than that. And the reason is because of certain public figures, such as this man, whose name is Hamza Yusuf. And he is the founder of what's called the Zaytuna Institute, which is an institute that was he established outside San Francisco about 10 years ago. And he is an interesting phenomenon, not only because of the influence that he's had in the United States within particularly second-generation Muslims, but also because of the particular reasons and characteristics that make him important to the Muslim American experience. And as you can tell, he's a convert. So he grew up in California. He actually was born into a Greek Orthodox family. His parents were academics, and he studied almost for a decade in the Arab world and in North Africa. He studied in Saudi Arabia and in North Africa. So when he returned in the late 90s to establish this institute, he had one primary goal. And he established the institute along with this person whose name is Imam Zaid Shakir. And they decided that they wanted to provide a classical Islamic education to young Muslims in America. And the reason that they decided to do this was well, there were two reasons. One is that they felt that there was an absence of any sort of religious authority in the United States. So even if you take, a country such as Great Britain as an example, you have an immigrant population who has had long-standing roots in the UK and France. Similarly in France, you have imams there who have come from North Africa in the case of France, or Pakistan in the case of the UK. So there has been a sort of a long tradition of some form of Islamic education in some countries in Europe. That was virtually absent in the United States. So when they returned 10 years ago, they realized, they saw this embracing of Islam, particularly by the younger generation, and they felt that there was a need to address this whole issue of Islamic education. The other reason they wanted to establish the institute was that they were very committed in providing a serious and classical education to young Muslims so that they would not acquire whatever knowledge they would have about Islam through the internet or through, other more informal ways. And they were very committed to doing this. Now, the difference between them, which I think is very important in understanding the Muslim American experience, the difference between them is that, as I pointed out, Hamza Yusuf is a convert from California. Imam Zaid Shakir was very active in the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s, and he also comes from this whole orientation of the Nation of Islam, which is a completely different experience in the United States than what we call immigrant Muslim experience. So the indigenous Muslims, the African American Muslims, have had a completely different experience for cultural reasons, political reasons, and of course because of their own experience in the United States, the Muslim Americans. And although my book does not address this particular issue, because I think that this is a whole different set of literature that regards specifically African American Muslims, but there has historically been a divide that was exacerbated beginning in the 1960s when the Johnson administration lifted quotas so that more Muslims from Muslim countries, Pakistan, Egypt, could immigrate to the United States. And I'll get to this later, but this also altered the demographics. So historically, while the majority of Muslims in America were African Americans, such as Imam Zaid Shakir, this began shifting beginning in the 1960s. And as you will see from some statistics I'll show you in a moment, there's a bit of a debate, but either Arabs or South Asians now comprise the largest part of the population, which is estimated, depending upon whose estimates you consider credible, about 6 million Muslims. What has happened since the Zaytuna Institute was established is that they've created what I sort of characterize in the book as mobile madrasas. So these two imams, much less so Hamza Yusuf now, but Zaid Shakir, they travel around the United States and they basically rent hotels or conference halls where thousands and thousands of Muslims gather, not only from the United States, but in some cases Europe, because I've been to some of these sessions. And they discuss the Islamic sources, they discuss the Hadith, they discuss the Quran, and they try to discuss these texts in terms of what's relevant for young Muslims in the United States. So again, this was part of their mission to depart from this kind of tradition that maybe some young Muslims' parents had of going to mosques where there are these alien imams from the Islamic world who had no sort of idea about what was relevant to their lives in America. And when I attended many of these sessions, it was interesting because many of the questions they were asked often dealt with social issues. So some of the young Muslim women would say, what do you think that women should be veiled in a Western society? My parents, some of the questions regarded, issues about marriage. Some of the young women would ask, my father, who's very traditional Muslim from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, believes that I should get married very young. But I'm now a university student. I want to pursue a career. How can I reconcile these conflicts? And it was very interesting because you saw in these discussions the generational divide which has developed in this country between the first generation and the second sort of played out in many of these conversations. So that's the aim of the Zaytuna Institute, and it's been very successful in doing that, and it has become really part of this, what I think is a movement in the United States, particularly among second-generation Muslims, to become much more learned about Islam and to incorporate Islamic practice and tradition into their lives. The other part of my research really was trying to determine what the role of the mosque is, and it's a changing role within Muslim communities in the United States post 9/11. This is a picture of the Dick's Mosque, as it's sort of commonly called, which is located in Dearborn. This is the inside of the mosque, which is a reading room. I've sort of explored different mosque communities and tried to find a community that I thought was that was traditional and conservative, because I tried to, in my research, sort of expose the whole breadth of the community in all its diversity. So yes, you have secular Muslims, which I didn't really focus on. You have sort of second-generation mosque goers who, what we would call fairly progressive Muslims, even though I don't really like to use that terminology. And you also have some mosques in America which are extremely, extremely conservative. This mosque is actually controlled by immigrants from Yemen. It includes thousands of worshippers. Part of the community, for example, only speaks Arabic. The khutbah every Friday, the sermon, is in Arabic, not English. And until only a few years ago, women were forced to pray in the basement. And I'll address this issue later. But in the United States, even here, there is often a separation in the mosque between women and men. And the degrees of separation vary depending upon the degree of conservatism inside the mosque. So at this mosque, I thought it was very interesting because it's extremely patriarchal. And the generational divide was most apparent at this mosque for many of the ones I visited, because you had the very traditional parents, most of whom were from Yemen, trying to raise children who were also very conservative, because many of the young women there were headscarves. They attended religious sessions every Sundays, which I would attend, and they were very committed to remaining in the community, and they wanted to raise their children in the community. So you didn't have this sort of trend that we see, among most young Americans, which is to leave the place where they grew up, to establish some sort of social mobility. In this community, in fact, even the younger generation that wanted to remain in the community still had great conflicts with their parents. Some of the young women I interviewed, for example, their fathers didn't want them to attend university, and this was presented a huge conflict inside the community. There's also a very high rate of domestic violence in this community, which again stems from this kind of traditional approach to life, and this was also a big point of contention between the first and the second generation. And I think that what was again interesting was that in this mosque, just like in the mobile madrasas that Imam Hamza Yusuf and Imam Zaid Shakir were conducting around the country, the young people in this mosque wanted to become more schooled in a classical Islamic education. And they tried, and I thought that this is a very interesting example, they were very committed to trying to distinguish between what is doctrine, what is Islamic doctrine, and what is tradition. So they were very aware of the kinds of practices that existed within their family were actually cultural and not religious. And this was a distinction that they were very, very concerned about inside this community. And as I said, and the way I witnessed this was through these Sunday sessions with women, as I came to know the male governing board of the mosque, the male-dominated governing board of the mosque, they also allowed me to attend some of their sessions where they discussed how to basically govern the mosque. And so there was a lot of concern within this community of how to reconcile this generational divide, and you had the younger generation much more interested in Islamic doctrine, and the older generation much more interested in recreating the village. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this particular mosque is that its development and the way it evolved from what you saw in the previous slide to how it developed from this slide to the previous slide is really the story of mosques in America in general. As you can see, this is how the mosque looked in 1952. It was actually a pool hall, and which is also somewhat the story of mosques in America, because when many Muslims started coming here, immigrant Muslims, they didn't know how to go about constructing a mosque. There wasn't funding for constructing a mosque because, of course, the funds come from the worshippers, and there were very few Muslims in many of these communities. So, the first worshippers to actually come to this community were Lebanese, and they came from the Mecca Valley, and this was their mosque. And what has happened, particularly since 9/11, is that there's been a proliferation of mosques all over the United States. And also there's been an expansion of existing mosques. So in the case of the Dix Mosque, the huge mosque that you saw on the previous slide, it was expanded just in the course of the 2 years that I did research there. There are now crystal chandeliers inside this mosque, beautiful oriental carpets. The women no longer pray in the basement. They have to pray, though, in a room that actually exists only, you can only enter through the alley. So there's still, of course, a lack of gender equality in this community, but it has expanded. It used to be probably a fourth smaller than what you can see here. And this is not the entire, this frame does not reflect the entire mosque. It's extensive, it's quite long. And it is the worshippers, not funding from Saudi Arabia or the Gulf or even from Yemen, that made the expansion of this mosque possible. And that has also been a new sort of phenomenon post 9/11, whereby because of the U.S. government restrictions on charities and mosques and this sort of thing, funding has come from inside the communities. I even witnessed in some cases that women in this mosque would give their gold that their parents had brought for them from Yemen, or that they had from Yemen, gold jewelry, as a contribution to the mosque expansion, which is, you know, quite impressive. So I'm going to show you now some statistics just to give you some idea of, you know, who are Muslims in America, who are they? And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, historically the majority have been African American. But as you can see from this statistic, which comes from a study that Pew Forum did on religion and public life, it's a think tank and survey research firm in Washington. They conducted in 2007 probably, well, certainly the most definitive study to date on Muslims in America. And because, as some of you have already mentioned to me, there are now, you know, there's extensive research on this subject. People are now getting PhDs and conducting all sorts of, you know, formal study of this topic. There has been a great need for surveys because we don't even know really, as I mentioned earlier, how many Muslims there are in the United States, because obviously the U.S. Census cannot collect this kind of data. And the number itself has become very politicized, because a lot of scholars, I think most objective scholars, agree that the number is about 6 million, but some political interest groups even argue that the number is as small as 1.5, which I think is not very accurate. But in any case, this is a very important study, and as you can see, Arabs from Muslims from the Arab region are 24%. The Muslims from Europe are very small, 5%, native-born 35%, African-American 20%. And that's a very different kind of picture than we saw 40 years ago. So when did Muslims immigrate? This was a very surprising statistic when I saw it, because as you can see, there was a great immigration in 1990 and 1999, and I had thought that the greatest wave of immigration had come actually sooner. But that seems to be the largest wave of immigration. And then from 2000 to 2007, 27.5%, which is also a bit surprising if you consider sort of what the perception is in the Islamic world of the United States. So it's a bit surprising that, that Muslims are still wanting to immigrate here. And there was a story actually last summer in the New York Times, the front page of the New York Times, which interviewed a lot of recent immigrants, who, particularly the ones that were interviewed were from Pakistan, South Asia, and they said that basically, yes, we don't agree with U.S. policies, we don't agree with, you know, what the United States has done in Iraq and Afghanistan and various parts of the Middle East, but we still feel that because of the economic conditions in our own societies, high unemployment rates, that, you know, what else can we do? Here we are in America. So I would say that even though the spin of the article was that, you know, there's public opinion is not so negative in the Muslim world against the United States and U.S. policies, that a more careful examination, if you read the quotes, you know, what they were expressing was really sort of the lesser of two evils, basically, and they found that America was still a place where they could prosper as opposed to their countries of origin. Now, this is another very important statistic which comes from a different survey conducted in 2004 by Zaytuna International and a project at Georgetown University called Project MAPS. And I always show this in the United States, particularly to more public audiences, not at universities, because as you can see, Muslims in this country are very, very educated. 59% have college degrees, where only a very small percentage have only some high school. And this is a completely different kind of picture than you see among Muslims in European countries, whether it be in France or in the UK, because generally they are far less educated than the general population, and they are part of the underclass. By the way, feel free to interrupt me if you like. I have this way of just talking, but I know that a lot of you are studying this subject, so if you have any questions to ask as I'm talking, you don't necessarily have to wait till the end. And then people are very surprised by this because they don't understand that Muslims here are so well educated, and that also they, hold professional jobs. I mean, look at their occupations. You can see that 23% of those surveyed, and the survey included 1,800 Muslims who were interviewed by phone, but 23% are from professional or the technical sector, whereas if you go up the chart, only 4% in service and 3% in blue collar. Again, this is completely different from the kind of situation that we see. In Germany, for example, the Muslim population is predominantly from Turkey, and they are guest laborers even now, even though they are now 20 or 30 years into the big wave of immigration that occurred there. So,
can I ask you a question related
sure.
to this? The data on education is very dramatic. I mean, and if you were to look at a similar graph for Europe, it would be just the opposite. But I wonder if, in a sense, what you showed us is a little bit spurious, because I wonder if you disaggregate the people who came since 1980 from those who are already here. That's a small sample. That's about 15%. My hunch is that 15% pretty much, look very differently. My hunch is that would be a population sample with a relatively small number of college graduates and so on. So I think what's reflected is the people who have come since 1980 have come under immigration rules which have been biased towards people with professional skills and education and so on. So,
yes, that is so. And neither this survey nor the Pew survey does this kind of generational breakdown, only on certain issues. And I'll show you one statistic. Let me just move to it. Now, this is a very interesting statistic that I think speaks to your point. They asked a few questions like this, not on issues of education or income levels, but they asked this question, and I just created this chart to show you. Do you think of yourself as Muslim first or American first? Now, every survey always asks this question, which I think is a very false question anyway. I mean, how can you ask people to choose? And also, I mean, any Muslim, whether he or she is here in the Islamic world, obviously is always going to say that he or she is a Muslim first for a lot of complicated reasons. But nonetheless, you can see from this chart that there is a difference between the 18 to 29-year-olds who answered yes in higher percentages to do you consider yourself Muslim first. So they consider themselves Muslim first in greater percentages 18 to 29-year-olds than over 30. The blue, the gray area is Muslim first. So, you know what? I did this chart wrong. It's the reverse. Yeah, sorry. So it's the gray. Oh no, sorry, 60%. Sorry, I was getting mixed up. I thought that I did the chart wrong. Yeah, so 60% of 18 to 29-year-olds said that they're Muslim first, whereas 41% said they were Muslim first. American first, 25%. The younger generation, 30%. The the first generation. So you can see the difference between the parents and the children, essentially. I mean, to some degree.
You talked about this in your book, though. I mean, this identity, this Islamic identity that's coming up among the younger generation was pretty much a reaction to what was happening to Muslims after 9/11. So it was the younger generation that was rising and saying, wait, I'm going to reassert this identity, whether I was a practicing Muslim or not, now I'm a Muslim.
Yes, that's true. And I mean, the other important factor in all of this is that we don't have statistics on this, but just anecdotally, the second generation that is educated, their parents, generally speaking, came from secular elite backgrounds. So a lot of the children that I interviewed, for example, their parents either came to get PhDs in the United States, or they came you know, from Egypt in the 1960s. They came from Pakistan because they were sort of fleeing what they saw to be, to some degree, the transformation of their own societies. And they remained here. So that is another factor in sort of the educational levels and the income levels. Now, you can see also that this sort of speaks to, you know, your point, that young Muslims are attending mosque. So we can see that they attend mosque weekly or more by 50%, which I think is quite high. This comes from the Pew Forum survey. 24% a few times a month or a year. And I'm sure, again, because we don't have any statistical information before 9/11, I'm sure, though, that if the same question had been asked before 9/11, you would get a far less percentage who say that they go to mosque weekly or more. And this is, you know, what I just gathered anecdotally from visiting these communities. And the other thing that I failed to mention about the Dick's Mosque, like many mosques, is that the role of the mosque in the United States has changed. You know, the mosques have not only expanded, but they've become social centers for education. Arabic is taught now in many mosques, and when I would travel around, I noticed in many mosques, for example, on a Friday night, young people by the hundreds would come to sort of listen to the imam, and they would have private sessions among the younger generation that began with high school students onward to university students with the imam. This is how people spent their Friday nights, which to me was a bit shocking. But particularly in a place like Dearborn, where you have a very active community and a very cohesive community, the imams play a great role with the younger generation. Okay, this is just another interesting chart to show you that 70% are married Muslims, as opposed to 18% and 11%. Religion of spouse, another interesting. So 89% of those surveyed, this is the Zogby poll, 89% have spouses who are also Muslim. Now, the last topic I'm going to talk about just briefly is the whole issue of gender equality among Muslims in the United States. And I think that there are some parallels regarding this subject if you compare sort of what the burning issues are here in the United States versus some Islamic societies abroad. The person in this slide who's featured is Dr. Ingrid Mattson, who is now the president of the Islamic Society of North America. She is also a professor of Islamic Studies at Hartford Seminary. And she, I think, has been very influential and instrumental in bringing these very delicate issues about gender equality that until a few years ago were for the most part hidden within these Islamic communities, Muslim communities, to public attention. Even before she became the president of ISNA, that's the acronym for the organization, she was very active in counseling imams in many of the mosques in the United States. And as I sort of wrote about one particular anecdote, which I thought was funny, in one of the sessions where I attended, in which she gave these seminars to sort of address this whole issue of the separation of the mosque, because women are often separated from men, as I mentioned, and the degree of separation sort of depends upon how conservative the mosque is. But nonetheless, in many mosques, it's very difficult for women to hear the imam and to sort of, engage in the whole spiritual experience. So in trying to bring these issues into, public focus inside the communities, she would travel around the country and give lectures to the imams. And at one that I attended, she gathered about 12 people in a room, only 2 or 3 of whom were women, and the rest were men. And before she began her lecture, she said, okay, I want all the men to leave this room and move to the adjoining room. It was this, very sort of sterile sort of office space. And she said, and take your chairs with you. So they took their folding chairs and they moved to the adjoining room. And then she closed the door and continued her lecture only for the few women sitting in the room. So in no time, you could hear the men in the room next door. And finally, eventually they came and knocked and said, wait, what's going on? We can't hear you. And she said, well, that's precisely my point. This is what women experience every Friday in your mosque. So these were the kinds of lessons that she very effectively debate across the country. I mean, I'm sort of simplifying her message. I think in a more profound way, much like Hamza Yusuf, and maybe not Hamza Yusuf so much so because he's sort of been reincarnated since 9/11, since I did my research, but I would say among religious public intellectuals, she classifies herself as a neo-traditionalist, which I think is an interesting sort of classification. And a reason to sort of, you know, observe and conduct research about this part of the population. She's religious, she wears a headscarf, but she's, as you can see, obviously, I mean, she's a college professor, she's a community activist, she's a modern, liberated woman. And this is very much, I think, it very much speaks to the core of this movement which I wrote about, the second generation, because they are trying to certainly benefit from all the advantages in American society while also trying to maintain religiosity in a public sense and also become much more educated formally about their faith. And so I think that in one person she embodies a lot of the characteristics that we're seeing in this movement, particularly among young Muslims. So I'd just like to conclude by saying that, I mean, I think that that among this particular population within the community where I conducted research, we do see religious expression in a very public way that didn't exist before 9/11. We see a younger generation that is much more interested in learning about Islam and distinguishing religion, doctrine from culture and tradition. And I think that what is also happening is that we are seeing a younger generation that is becoming much more engaged in the public debate in this country. And it's this point that I'd sort of like to conclude on. I've been part of many of these discussions and much of the activism that goes on in Washington, and was part of this project at the UN that included a lot of Muslims. And what has happened, I think, is very interesting. And again, I think it's very, it illustrates the American experience. You have the emergence of now public intellectuals who are Muslim Americans, particularly young Muslim Americans. And what has been interesting is to examine what they're writing in the media and what is being said publicly, because to some degree they have, and this has become an internal debate within the community, given the choice between being the other, which would force them to publicly address many of the sensitive issues that America is obsessed with, extremism, Al-Qaeda, anti-American sentiment abroad, they have, for some, they have adopted a different strategy, which is to show that Muslim Americans are completely assimilated into American society, that they want to de-emphasize anything that would characterize them as the other. And this is the split that is now, that we're seeing, I think, become almost on public display. But I think the part of the community, though, that is, in my view, almost becoming apologist and has adopted this strategy, at least in Washington, is much more dominant and prevalent. And I think that we're also seeing this even in survey research. Because the polling that's been done, in the sort of war of ideas about Muslim public opinion, okay, whether it be in the United States or abroad, there are now polling agencies that are being paid by Saudi Arabia, various other people with certain interests and agendas to try to reframe the public debate based upon Muslim opinion. What do Muslims here in the United States think? What do Muslims in the broader Islamic world think? And I think that if you look at one of the criticisms, for example, of the Pew survey, was that, and I brought it here, this is the headline, okay, Muslim Americans, middle class and mostly mainstream, which is interesting, okay, and as we saw from the statistics, you could certainly conclude that, but when you look at the specific statistics, you could also lead to a much more complex conclusion, which is that, I mean, does mainstream mean increased mosque attendance? Does mainstream mean that Muslim identity is considered first before American identity? And when I asked the social scientists who conducted this survey, I said, why did you, I'm very interested because in reading the data, I would never come up with this title. And he said, well, we don't want to write anything negative because that's what the media will pick up on. So we don't want to expose lack of assimilation. We want to emphasize assimilation. And so, unfortunately, I guess for them, many of the headlines were still negative because reporters went and read the actual data and results. So my point is that I think it's very interesting in the public debate that is emerging in this country, and it's particularly apparent in Washington, over this divide between how Muslims are going to be projected in the United States, both Muslims abroad and here. Are they going to be projected as patriotic citizens? And is it American citizenship? Is that what they're embracing? Or are they going to be projected as Muslims who are very similar to those in the Islamic world who are against U.S. policies and who are very much, at this point, to some degree, believe that the United States has launched a war against Islam? And so if this topic interests you, I would advise you to read the papers very closely, because for very good reasons, many Muslims now are writing in the press. They're writing books. I have one with me, which I was sharing with some of you now. It's a new book that's actually coming out in September. That's written. It's a very, very good book, written by a scholar, a young scholar who studied under Edward Said. His name is Mustafa Bayoumi, and the title is "How Does It Feel to Be a Problem?" And you can see that the question is also posed in Arabic. And this is published by a trade house. So we're seeing a whole, a lot of literature coming out on this subject. And so thank you very much.
I greatly enjoyed your presentations, and I really find it very fascinating work. I was curious, based on your experiences of working in the Middle East, and you were exposed firsthand to the struggles within Middle Eastern societies and the rise of Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood. I wanted to ask you about your take on the presence of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States, and also the influence of Saudi money, not only in the public, the institutions polling the numbers, but also in academic circles. And how is that influencing and shaping the debate around the reality of Muslim life in America?
I feel that I'm not really qualified to speak about the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States, because I didn't conduct research specifically on that subject. I mean, certainly historically, the Muslim Brotherhood did have presence and influence, particularly in the Muslim Students Associations. And that's the whole topic I didn't really mention. The Muslim Students Associations are very, very instrumental now on college campuses across the country in this kinds of this intensification of Islam and the Islamic identity, which I talked about, as are many other kinds of institutions. Historically, the Muslim Brotherhood had been very influential and had funded in the early days the Muslim Students Associations. But what influence is there now? I would say minimal, and the FBI agrees. Okay, I mean the kind of work that the FBI did after 9/11, they concluded that they really didn't see influence by the Muslim Brotherhood here in the United States. I think, though, what has happened that sort of relates to your other question, there are, of course, institutes just like this one that devoted now to Muslim studies that are developing across the country, which is very positive. And some of the money for these institutes is coming from abroad. What influence that will have on academia? I mean, I don't necessarily think that you can draw a conclusion that because money is coming from Saudi Arabia for, say, the Center for Muslim and Christian Understanding of Georgetown, that there's going to be some sort of Saudi influence on that institution. That's what sort of other people might argue, but I don't think that there's any real evidence of that. And there has been, in the Chronicle of Higher Education, various other, sort of the literature about this subject, there's been a real debate about, whether funding equals influence. And I don't think that there's any evidence of that at this point, even though some people would sort of make the counter argument. I think it's very good that there are, Muslim studies institutions now. I mean, it's a topic that, this country obviously needs to learn more about, the Muslim world. And it's amazing that, in the wake of 9/11, if you examine what most Americans know about Muslims and Islam, I mean, it was quite shocking. And even as I go around and give lectures around the country, we're now 7 years away from 9/11, and it's pretty surprising how little, the lack of knowledge. And what's also interesting is that a little knowledge has become very dangerous, because if you take a name like Sayyid Qutb, okay, there are many Americans now who read Reader's Digest, and know that there was this man in Egypt, a radical ideologue by the name of Sayyid Qutb. And so, or they read in a book that's, somewhat biased of this radical Sayyid Qutb and how he's the real, leader of the modern jihad. And I've had conversations with people who are, activists. I mean, there are all sorts of councils all over the United States, New Hampshire Humanities Council, all these sort of organizations of educated Americans who aren't necessarily specialists or academics, but who want to know about the Islamic world. But what's become a bit dangerous is they now sort of talk in these buzzwords that they've learned from Newsweek and Time Magazine and Reader's Digest. And as soon as I try to, sort of argue that, introduce them to the whole issue of extremism, they say, yes, but what about this man Sayyid Qutb? So anyway, I think that Americans have become more educated than they were, but in some cases a little knowledge has become a bit dangerous.
I'm sure you touch on this in your book, but I haven't had a chance to read your book, though I have purchased it. But my question concerns where you think, in general, gender relations are going, and in particular, what kind of forces you see as ascendant among observant Muslim women in the United States. Is the neo-traditionalist synthesis that the woman, the professor at Hartford Seminary is advocating, is that sort of resonating broadly, or do you see much more divergent currents operative simultaneously?
I think it's both. I think among the religious younger Muslims, particularly, say, students who would become members of a Muslim Students Association, the Ingrid model is sort of the model. Okay, so because she has managed to navigate this difficult world between religion and modernity in the United States, or what is expected socially of women in the United States. So she has very skillfully navigated these two worlds. And this is why she's, somewhat of a model for young women, not only her, but many other activists who are women. And I think that it is difficult, as a lot of women started wearing headscarves after 9/11. And when I interviewed them and said, why did you start wearing headscarves at this very difficult time? Obviously, there's going to be a lot of pressure, social pressure. Their answer was, they gave two answers for the most part. One was they wanted to demonstrate to Americans the true Islam. So they wanted, again, back to my previous point, they wanted to distinguish themselves from the militant in Baghdad and the hijacker in the World Trade Center. The second reason was that they felt that they were now in a defensive position. So they had to defend the faith. Okay, and they felt that they almost became ambassadors of the faith. So they wanted people to understand that they weren't ashamed to be Muslims, that they were going to engage in this public expression of religiosity in order to show that they were proud of their faith and they weren't going to be driven either inside mosques to hide there or driven into secular American society to become anonymous simply because of the sort of growing Islamophobia in American society. And so I think, though, among secular Muslims, again, that it's also become somewhat of a polarized debate because it's a lot of these sort of opinions have been moderated to some degree, but if you follow the writing and the work of Irshad Manji, for example, you had people like that who emerged onto the public scene to criticize these kinds of religious symbols. Okay, that women in Western society shouldn't wear headscarves, that Islam oppresses women, this sort of thing. So you did have, for some time, a very polarized debate among Muslims. And I think that that has subsided to some degree, and both sides are sort of coming to the center. People like Irshad Manji, who we call sort of secularists, for lack of a better terminology, she's softened her position. And I think if you take someone like Hamza Yusuf, I mean, he's a perfect example of this. He issued an opinion after 9/11 telling women to remove their headscarves because they were under so much pressure. There was an increase in hate crimes. You know, people all over the country told stories about even just going to the supermarket, which became problematic. People would, you know, say discriminatory things, make very derogatory remarks in the supermarket. So he said, don't wear the headscarf, it's okay not to wear the headscarf. Well, this became a debate among religious scholars all over the world who were sort of weighing in on his opinion and said, you know, this is sort of, you know, heretical kind of advice. Women should wear headscarves. So these kinds of debates have gone on internally for a long time, but I think, as I said, I think that all of these positions are now reaching a more centrist position than they were after 9/11.
You mentioned when you were talking about the community in Detroit that there were high rates of domestic abuse. I was wondering, first of all, how did you come across that kind of data? What kind of reporting was there? Is it through field work, or was there some sort of survey undertaken? And also, are there any calls within or without the community to address the issue?
In the case of the particular community around Dick's Mosque, there's an organization, an old organization, Arab organization called Access in Dearborn. It's in Dearborn, Detroit. They have different branches, but I think it's in both places. They did do work in the community to address this issue of domestic violence, and unfortunately they would not give me the results of their research because it had been conducted in the late 90s and it was a very sensitive subject within the community. And I spent some time trying to get access to their conclusions, but didn't spend a lot of time because it really wasn't the focus of what I was trying to do. So what I had gathered from what their work was in this particular community was just anecdotally. So some of the university students, for example, who had been going to some of these sessions told me that it took a lot of work even to organize these kinds of public discussions, but that there was a big problem in this community and that it had to be addressed. There were similar situations that I found in other places. There was a mosque outside Chicago called Bridgeview. And the young people in this mosque, it was very interesting, they founded a youth center because they wanted to have very open discussions among their peers on issues such as premarital sex, drug abuse, alcohol abuse. And the youth center, I think, existed for a year or two, but the very traditional mosque governing board, male-dominated, closed it down. And again, it was a huge dispute inside the community, generational divide. Young generation says, no, we have to talk about these issues publicly. Older generation says, no, Muslims shouldn't be airing their dirty laundry, particularly after 9/11. And as it was told to me, there was a huge outburst over this issue when the young woman who had actually founded the youth center stormed into one of the mosque board meetings and demanded to be heard. And the imam of this mosque is actually Palestinian, and there's a long, it's an old Palestinian community, and they said, you know, don't you know your place? Women aren't supposed to storm into mosque governing board meetings and demand their stay. But anyway, so these are some of the kinds of stories that I heard around the country, particularly regarding these very sensitive subjects.
Yeah, hi. You talked about Hamza Yusuf several times, and one thing I wanted to ask your opinion on is there has been, you know, for almost several decades, this emphasis by American Muslims to have their own ulama, to have their own traditions and their own institutions of learning in the United States. But I'm still finding, like, you go to the Zaytuna website, and as you said, it talks, oh, we went to study in Morocco, we went to study in Saudi, and so, as someone said to me, well, we have people, we're generating our own scholars because we have people going overseas to study now. So my question is there do you think it can be sort of a centrifugal phenomena where the American Muslim community wants its own scholars, but the ultimate legitimacy is still overseas, whether it's in Saudi Arabia, whether it's in Egypt, whether it's Morocco, and how you think that'll affect the development? And the second thing really quick is, I was interested in how we're supposed to tell from his photo alone that he was a convert.
That's a good point. Yeah, you can't tell from this photo alone that he's a convert. But I mean, I think that if you were to look at him, you know, you might sort of wonder where he possibly be from.
Right, well,
But yeah,
it's because it's a really, in what I've seen in the Muslim community, and within the Muslim community itself, there's this sort of taken up of the dark, light, foreign, quote, American dichotomy, and as you showed in the chapter, I mean, there's European, there's Balkan Muslims, there's second generation children of converts in the United States, and there's children of intermarriage, and there's light-skinned Muslims from the Middle East. So it's just kind of an interesting assumption that we make that.
that's true. Your first point is a very important one. The answer is complex. I mean, the reason that if you go to the Zaytuna Institute and they're both, well, I don't think Imam Zayd Shafii studied too long in the Middle East, but it's to establish street credibility, which is still very necessary. So it's true. It does seem somewhat of a contradiction. Okay, you have second generation Muslims, so as I said, they want a classical Islamic education that speaks to their status as modern Muslims living as minorities in Western society. So they don't want these aging imams reading the Quran and Friday prayers. Okay. At the same time, they also, because of the internet, because you have the situation as I described, where Hamza Yusuf issues an opinion, but you have, Sheikh Kardawi in Doha weighing in on the internet, that this kind of credibility, the points of reference, I guess we shall say, are the important points of reference are still in the Islamic world. And that's, again, this is, I think, what's so fascinating about the development of second generation Muslims and their influences both here and in Europe is to what degree the influence and the points of reference still remain in the Islamic world and how that affects what happens in a Western society. And that's what, frankly, governments have been challenged with, is in Europe in particular, that in trying to influence public opinion, to some, they've learned, okay, there are only there are limits to policing, visa restrictions, all of these things. And in fact, several scholars now have written extensively on sort of the limits of integration, because of this whole phenomenon whereby you can't control the points of references and you can't control, how people are influenced. And it has become obviously a global village, and the most authoritative religious scholars for a lot of Muslims, second generation living in the West, are still in the Islamic world. And
just one quick thing to go along with that, it's interesting, you mentioned the internet and information technology is so critical in comparison to early generations. I had one Muslim woman tell me, well, if my husband and I want a decision, we're going to go online and we're going to get a real scholar from Al-Azhar, when in her community, there's actually someone who did study in Al-Azhar, but that's still not as good as going on the internet and going to talk to the people who are physically at Al-Azhar.
No, it is, and I think it's this need for what is considered sort of a classical and more purified interpretation. And there is this perception that can be acquired if you log on and go to Al-Azhar. And also, to be perfectly honest, I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood now has a website in English, so there's been a lot of learning on the other side as well. If you want to speak to some of the religious scholars, they all have their websites. I mean, even if you want to speak to clerics in Iran, directly, there's a website of a cleric who was under house arrest for many years, Ayatollah Montazeri, and if you want his views, you just write to him on the internet. So, and that has contributed greatly to the sort of evolution of, Muslim status in Western societies. It's 5 after lunch. Should we take more questions, or do you want to?
Maybe we can take 1 or 2 short questions, and then we'll have a break for a reception. Yeah, is that okay? Yeah.
Could you reflect on the similarities and differences between Islamic organizations in the United States? Basically three. I'm familiar with three national organizations, ISNA, then there's MAS, and CAIR. Are they similar in terms of their membership, or are you familiar with these kind of differences? Yes. And how they view American Muslims? Because I was checking the website of the Islamic Society here in Boston, and the new mosque in Roxbury, in the minaret Avenue, and there was the American flag attached to the minaret, and then it was kind of different for someone who's coming from a different background, and apparently and honestly, who doesn't have this kind of like positive image of American flag in the sense that you would understand Islam.
No, it is, and yeah, I mean, that's a very perceptive question, because this is, all of these debates now, internally have become quite hostile since 9/11. You have, for example, CARE, an organization that's much more politically oriented, rather than ISNA, that's more concerned about social issues and that sort of thing. At CARE, for example, I guess when 9/11 happened, it was an organization that became the target of, some sort of extremist presence in the United States, because in their previous writings and public statements, they basically said that they supported Hamas, and that I haven't studied their statements. It was interpreted in the media that they also came out in favor of suicide bombings and this sort of thing. So once some of these organizations were under the media spotlight, they had to, and they've made enormous progress at becoming very politically savvy. And I even moderated, just to give you an example, so a few years ago in Chicago, a panel discussion of Muslim leaders who were all debating whether Muslims in America should even talk about Palestine in public. Should we just abandon the foreign policy agenda? Should we only talk about homeland security issues in America? Forget about Palestine. We can't help the Palestinians. We need to help ourselves. Okay? Talking about Palestine only puts us in the, in this stereotype of extremists, and we're never going to make any progress in this country politically. We'll never be able to run for office. We'll never be able to build our organizations. We'll never be able to, organize on college campuses if we talk about Palestine. So, so CARE has redefined itself. And again, I don't follow, very closely their organization. They've also, to some degree, the leadership has changed. So in CARE, you did have older Muslims who weren't born in this country. That has changed. In fact, I was just meeting someone a few days ago who told me that they brought in a fairly young woman from the West Coast to try to, once again, sort of, recreate a different image. So there's a lot of concern. An organization like ISNA is really, it's still, for the most part, other than Ingrid Mattson, the leadership is fairly, much the old guard that established this sort of period of ISNA, I would say 10 to 20 years ago. And its function is not so much as a political organization, but they hold a convention every year, usually in Chicago on Labor Day, where 40,000 Muslims come together, and it's really an important gathering because they have simultaneous discussions in this huge convention hall in Chicago, and they debate everything from wearing headscarves in Western societies to working with the FBI to issues about how they can build their organizations and their institutions. The MSAs at this convention have their own convention, generally on the first floor of the convention. So they all gather, all the leaders in these Muslim Student Associations from across the country. They compare notes. They try to figure out how to help, their different chapters raise funding and this sort of thing. So that's sort of what ISNA does, just to give you some sort of difference in their approach.
That's great. Why don't we stop at this point? And if you have questions, I have an informal chance during the reception to offer them a statement. Thank you very much.